Hello everyone and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Adz Lyson. Before we start, can I please ask you subscribe and follow on your podcast provider and share with anyone who would enjoy the podcast. Also, if you're looking for some surf gear, go to Northcore on the internet and use the promotion code GrumpySurfer10, capital letters, to receive 10% off your purchase. If I can also use this opportunity just to say Happy New Year to everybody. I hope your holiday was good. I hope Santa brought you everything that you wanted and asked him for. I also hope that everyone had the opportunity to be around their families, whether it was indoors or outdoors, or you could do Zoom, or you had a few phone calls and you were able to do something to occupy yourself. I know it's been quite a hard time this year, which leads me on to saying thank you very much for supporting the podcast over the last 10 months. January is going to be a full lineup. It's loaded at the moment, so I hope you enjoy listening to them. Okay, on the podcast today, I have a photographer and writer. He is also the editor of one of the longest serving surfing magazines in the UK. Please enjoy my conversation with the editor of Wavelength Magazine, Luke Gartside. Luke Gartside, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, not bad.
What have you been up to today?
Not much so far. Just got up this morning, checked the waves. Not much good, howling northwesterly today. So just had a bit of breakfast, did a little bit of work. Got myself ready to chat.
Yeah, I've been checking the forecast this week and it doesn't look particularly good, but I think I might score Lynmouth next week by the looks of it.
Oh yeah, it's a cheeky Lynmouth chart coming up. Yeah, it's such a long drive from down here that I always be somewhere that I can never quite bother to drive up to. But I think you get lazy when you live right in the centre. Like I live right in the centre of Newquay, so we got so many average beaches close that I never actually make the effort to drive to the half decent waves.
Yeah, so for the people that are listening, the window where Luke's flat is literally facing straight out onto Fistral Beach, which is pretty epic, to be honest.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's really good. Like I say, it makes you a bit lazy, but you do. Last night I got the chance to get little windows where you're not sure if the swell's going to fill in or not, and you just kind of can't get any work done all day because you're just staring out the window, and then suddenly you'll see the first set of a new swell come in and just sprint down through the golf course. So it's nice when it's like that, but yeah, it does make you a bit lazy. Fistral far too much.
I like that. You're doing a little bit of work and the waves are good, and then just like that. It's a little bit like me, but with my line of work, it's a little bit different. People are like, where are you actually going?
Yeah,
I'm going surfing. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I don't. Luckily, with my job, I don't have to make too many excuses. I can just say like, "Oh, it's for work, isn't it? I've got to go surfing." Got to go surfing. That's where you come up with the best stories when you're out surfing. But
exactly. So, just so people know, just explain a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm the editor of Wavelength Magazine. I basically do everything from edit our print editions, which are biannual, to I run social media as well, and then I edit all the content output on the website with my colleague Paul, who's based down in Hossegor. He's our man on the ground in Europe, so I sort of cover the UK side of things, and then also work on little special projects that we do as well. We do some events, so we did a drive-in cinema this summer, and I was quite involved with sort of working on content to promote that. And then I do a lot of photography as well for the mag, so I'm always out and about shooting photos for the Instagram and for the website. Yeah, that about covers it, I think. It's kind of what exactly is in the magazine's remit kind of changes year to year as we kind of adapt to obviously the whole way the media landscape's changing. So that means my job actually morphs quite quickly. But yeah, it's great. It keeps you on the toes, always like new stuff to be working on. So I never thought I'd end up working so closely involved with events as I have done the last couple of years, but it's actually something I've really enjoyed. It's nice to actually get out and meet the people who read the magazine rather than just like seeing their comments on social media and stuff. So it's been really fun.
Events seem to be quite a big thing recently, don't they? I mean, obviously because of the time that we're in, especially this year with all the COVID stuff, everyone is trying to get outside a little bit more. You do see a lot of events, especially competitions, are still trying to run as well, which is kind of a big thing within the surfing community to a certain extent. Depends whether you're a purist or not, doesn't it? Whether you're into all that or into the surf contests. But it's definitely a way that you can get a platform out there to a bigger audience, I think. Necessarily the people that are in the surfing community, but people outside it as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I've seen like there have been quite a lot of cool little grassroots events popping up recently as well. So I was actually at the there's one at Little Fistral called the Single Fin Shootout, which I went down to on Sunday. And it was just so nice. There's no replacement for all getting together and seeing your mates and watching a bit of surfing, even if it's not particularly, even if you're not really following it. Like I was thinking when I was there yesterday, like if you haven't got, even with a beach announcer and a big screen on the beach, like you get if you go down to the comp in Hossegor or in Peniche or even like further afield, it's still quite hard quite a hard sport to follow. So I think when you have a nice grassroots comp like that and there's no announcer and there's no screen with the scores on, it does just become not so much about watching and following what's happening with the surfing, but it's just much more of a get together. So there was another one as well down in Bournemouth recently, the Channel Coast Log Jam, which I didn't make it down to, but I think it's events like that. I can see why they're kind of on the upsurge, because I think those more than the formalized competitive events like the QS comps and stuff, I think they're less enjoyable. The grassroots ones are definitely more enjoyable to attend as a viewer and as an attendee, even if you're not following the action quite as closely.
Do you feel that because of the COVID period and people are been more inclined to stay at home or closer to home, that it's reinvigorated what you would call a community? So the surfing community globally is linked together because you enjoy the art of riding waves, but it can also be quite disconnected as well, because I'll use myself as an example. I'm super into surfing. I watch all the events. I read as many books and magazines that I can get my hands on. I'm always looking for like the newest clip that's coming out from whether it's the pros or, I've been mega into Torren Martin recently. I just found that randomly, and that's now like my new thing that I'm super into. Do you think that there's been a reinvigoration of a surfing community now because of the period we've been through?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think like I definitely saw it out in the lineup, particularly during lockdown, that surfing was one of people's only opportunities to socialise. So there are definitely people saying hello to each other in the lineup at North Fistral who might not usually, because you suddenly felt that camaraderie, particularly during the first lockdown where a lot of people couldn't surf. Obviously the rules were you could only really surf if you could walk to the beach, and so all of a sudden I think that like really brought the local surf community together, because everyone kind of, maybe there was a little bit of a sense that everyone was breaking the rules a little bit together, and so I've seen that it's definitely become more friendly in the water among that tight knit thing, among the sort of the tight knit group. But on a global level, yeah, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because within surfing, you almost have your little tribe who you're super friendly with, and then as soon as people come in from sort of outside that little tribe, I think people's natural reaction is to be quite hostile to them often. Someone told me a story yesterday actually about, they were up in Durzo, and it was a busy day up in Durzo and the waves were pumping, and a local guy took off on a wave and someone dropped in on him, and they both popped up in the white water and the guy was shouting and going mental, and then the guy who dropped in on him turned round and it turned out to be one of his old mates who he hadn't seen for years, and all of a sudden his attitude just flipped straight away and he was like, "Oh mate, I haven't seen you for ages. If I knew it was you, I would have said go, I would have shouted you onto it." So I think that we have like really close bonds with the people who we consider in our little circle, and then we're maybe more, we default to hostility with people who we think fall outside of that, and that doesn't exist in a lot of other sports. I don't think you get it in climbing. I don't think you get it so much in skateboarding. I think it is quite, it's probably not unique to surfing, but it is quite specific to surfing, that I think.
Do you think it's probably because there are more people now that are using surfing as, an outdoor activity, where back 20, even 10, 15 years ago, it probably wasn't as busy in the water?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense of that there's limited resources, kinda. I mean, I don't know. That's how people perceive it. I don't know whether waves are actually a limited resource strictly, but when you're out in the lineup, that's how it feels. Especially when there's long lulls between the sets, and you maybe get a 4-wave set, and you think like, I want to be on one of those 4 waves, and if people are getting in my way, or if people are paddling around me and not taking their turn, or some people's attitude is, I don't feel like there are other people in the lineup who aren't as entitled to those set waves as me because they're not as good or they don't live here or whatever. So I think it's that. I think it's the fact that it feels like a limited resource that breeds that that hierarchy and that hostility. And I don't think it's entirely a negative thing. I think it has its place. I think there's lots of places in the world where that pecking order is really important to like maintain some level of order and etiquette. Just like on the road. You don't. When my friends who don't surf ask me about it, that would be probably the example I'd use. Like the roads work because everyone knows the rules of the road, and if people cut each other up, then you are within your right to be a little bit annoyed about it, but to do it in a polite way, it's obviously best. But so I don't think it's entirely bad that hostility that sometimes exists, but. I don't know. Maybe it's something we could all work on a little bit personally.
Yeah, it's all down to people's own perceptions, isn't it? But also their own personality traits as well. You might have somebody that's super competitive, not necessarily surfing standard wise that good, but somebody drops in on them, they're going to get probably have a little shout at them or something like that. Whereas like I like to. Probably being a little bit older and I don't know, looking at it from an outsider's perspective, you shout at somebody that's done something wrong, they're going to have a negative effect from that. When I go with my friends, I go surfing with them. When I go into the water, I'm a little bit of a loner. I kind of like paddle off on my own a little bit. I don't like sitting in a pack. So if there's a peak going, I'll probably paddle off and find where's the empty space. Is there a wave break in there? I'll look for it. I'll use a little bit of my knowledge that I've gained over the years that I've been doing it, and I've gone, right, I'm going to go and sit there. But that's the way I enjoy it. Me going to a lineup, say for instance here at Little Fistral or somewhere when it's like super good and you've got a load of really good guys out. I don't really want to go and sit amongst them and have the hassle. And then probably catch a couple of waves. I want to go and get a few waves and enjoy it a little bit more. Okay, maybe if it's a shittier peak than, the one that everybody else is riding that's maybe barreling or something like that. But I'm doing it for my own purposes. If somebody drops in on me or does something wrong, I'm just kind of going, yeah, okay. There's plenty more coming through. But you spoil it for yourself if you get angry at that, don't you? For sure,
yeah. I always think the person in localized lineups around the world, which thankfully, we don't have many or hardly all of them in the southwest of Britain, but in heavily localized lineups around the world, I always think like, is that enforcer really having a good time? Surely it's ruining his surf, having to shout at people and be aggressive. Probably in his or her words that they'd be doing that to maintain order in the lineup and make sure that the locals are getting waves and that, but it must ruin their day a little bit, mustn't it? I don't know. I think you got to be a strange kind of person to have more fun being a regulator than just someone who's, like you say, paddling off, finding your own little peak and just having a nice surf. So I always feel a bit bad, like, because then you have to maintain it as well. Like once you've marked yourself out as the person who's regulating that lineup, you can't shout a little bit and then go back to putting your head down, and you've committed to it for the whole session. And if you get a reputation, maybe you've even committed to it for your whole surfing life. I can think of spots around Europe where the name of the main enforcer at that spot, and if they paddle out, they must feel that pressure on them. Like, oh God, I've got to be an enforcer again today. How annoying! Like,
you make it sound like an ice hockey game. The guys that's picking on the little ones, right, I'm going to deck him.
Yeah, maybe they get a kick out of it. I'm not sure. Maybe they get more of a kick out of it than they would from just taking a few waves. But
don't you find the hassles that the hassle is a lot more when it is maybe a little bit smaller. So let's use an average clean day of 2, 3, 4 foot, right? A lot of people out in the water like we've seen recently. You're probably going to get a lot more hassle during that time when you would call it a non-consequential day than the days that are bigger, shoulder, head high, bigger period where, the waves are a little bit more critical. You probably don't get it as much then either because people are concentrating on where they're sitting or their positioning to make those decent waves. We use the example of Lynmouth or a point break because that's basically what Lynmouth is a point break. You have that formative order, don't you? Where you're sat at the back, everyone takes a turn to catch their wave, comes back round, and they should technically go back to the back of that queue. And that's how it works. It's like a conveyor belt, isn't it?
Yeah, in theory.
In theory, depending whether you're local or not. And this is where localism comes in, right? If people start cutting in front of you, that's when you start getting a little bit of a sad on. But again, talking about localism and stuff, I guess that's where that enforcer type of guy comes in, right?
Yeah, I guess the idea is that if there's someone there who's having words with people, if they behave like that, it will minimize that behavior. That's the idea behind it. But I'm not sure. I haven't seen. I mean, there's places like Pipe, for example, where apparently it works pretty perfectly. But that's where you've stepped it up again, where the consequences aren't only getting shouted at or maybe getting punched on the beach, although I don't think that happens quite as much now. But you could also end up burning someone and them having to straighten out and going into the reef. So whereas at Lynmouth, if you paddle around someone, or if a point break or a beachy, you paddle around someone and you don't observe the turn-taking system, you're not actually putting anyone in mortal danger. So I think that yeah, there's obviously in those places, like you say, in those places where there's more consequences, it's kind of easier to observe that lineup etiquette because it seems that the consequences of you not doing it, you could really put someone in harm's way. So
yeah, let's talk a little bit about you. So where did you grow up?
So I grew up in West London originally till I was about 10 or 11, and then we moved out to a little village in Oxfordshire. My family, somewhere real rural, like about half an hour outside of Oxford, which is a very strange place, obviously, to be a kid obsessed with surfing. But I'm
a Midlander myself, so
yeah. Well, maybe not that strange then. I don't know. I feel like every surf lots. I remember around the time I was getting really into surf photography, lots of the surf photographers who I looked up to didn't seem to be from near the coast. Tim Nunn's from Ipswich or something, and Sharpie's from Somerset, and so certainly the mag editors at that time weren't. Obviously, there was exceptions. My favourite photographer when I was young was Mickey Smith from West Cornwall, but it didn't. I feel like there's something. The level of obsession that you build up when you're that far away from surfing, when you can't just connect to it by just looking out the window or going for a surf, so you have to study it and obsess over it through reading and watching films and stuff like that. And also when you go to the coast, even if you go to a bit of coast like Bournemouth, which is where I grew up surfing and sort of starting doing photography, you're stoked even if it's 2 foot and onshore, which it invariably is, because you've got that distance away. So yeah, it was a strange place to begin, but you don't take anything for granted when you grow up in rural Oxfordshire, because whenever you get a wave, it's like you're elated, you know.
Did you start photography basically because of surfing, or were you one of these people that goes for a nice little walk with your mum and dad, and you had a little camera and you're taking pictures of flowers and stuff like that?
Maybe a bit of flowers. I don't know. I always wanted to shoot like action stuff. I think it all came at the same time. So like I'd go out BMXing with my friends, and I was just not much good at it. So I'd end up taking photos of them, like going over jumps and stuff. And then from there, every time I was down in Cornwall, we'd come down to watch the board. I remember in about 2006, maybe coming down to watch the Boardmasters and just like having my dad's like DV cam, and just filming the whole thing and then getting home and making a little edit. Excuse me. Yeah, I remember coming down to Boardmasters in about 2006 and just having my dad's DV camera and just filming the whole thing and then going home and making a little edit of it. And And then from there, I just started shooting, anything action really. I shot in the snow dome. I used to go and shoot snowboarding in the Milton Keynes snow dome when they had a comp on with the kicker, and I used to go and shoot wakeboarding on like the wakeboarding lakes, and then I also used to go and shoot it behind the boat. There was an event called Wakestock, which one year they had like 20 minutes from where I lived near Oxford, and I just went down and shot that the whole weekend. So yeah, it was just anything sort of action based. But then the more I got into surfing, the more surfing became my focus with it really. So the more I both got into doing surfing, and the more I got the chance to come and watch people surfing. By about 16, 17, I was pretty much obsessed with shooting just surfing, and that's carried on really until now.
Were you into like writing then as well? Did you do a bit of writing and photography, or did that come a bit later?
I think it came a little bit later. I was always fairly into writing. Like my mum's she's actually an actor, but she's also like written plays and stuff. So she would always encourage us to, like, me and my sister, who now is also an actor and is also trying to write a play. So, but yeah, she would always encourage us to do bits of writing. And I when I finished my A-levels, I went around Europe in a van and then to Indo, and through all of that, I like kept a blog. Oh, I remember when I was 16 or possibly 17, the editor of Wavelength at the time, who was Ben Selway, they used to run this thing in Wavelength called Four Corners, where they would get like a really short little dispatch from each surfing region of the UK. And because I was always submitting photos from Bournemouth, he asked me if I'd like write that for Bournemouth. And I remember being at the time like, oh, is he mad? Like, he wants me to write in a surf mag. I remember emailing back like, I'm only 16 and I can't really write. And he was like, no, don't worry about it. And he used to edit it pretty heavily. I'm sure it was rubbish. But so I think that made me think like, oh, it's worth doing little bits of writing alongside the photography as well. And then, I really enjoyed writing a blog when I was in Indo, like writing about all the stuff I was shooting to sort of just go on the blog with the photos, because it was pre-Instagram. So I feel like now Instagram really encourages you to just stick shots out at like a rate of knots with short little captions, whereas back then everyone had like a Tumblr or a blog spot where it was kind of encouraged to do a bit more writing with it maybe. So I think that's partially why. And I really enjoyed writing as well. And then when I went to uni to do photography, I did a lot of writing alongside my photography then as well. So they kind of developed together, I guess.
That must have been pretty cool as a 16-year-old being asked to write a little section for Wavelength, one of the UK's, which still is now, premium surfing magazines.
Yeah, I was so stoked. I remember, and I told my mates, and they were just like, what are you talking about? Like, obviously all my mates into other stuff, living in rural Oxfordshire, couldn't really understand why I was always going down to the south coast, and then how I was now writing a bit about it in a magazine. I was elated about it, really happy. And I used to get real excited. And I used to go down, because I had to submit one each month. And I used to like proper try and do my research to make sure it was really good. So I'd like speak to lots of different, like on Facebook, I'd message all the surfers from down there who I knew and be like, right, what's going on? And try and pull it together into something good. It was really good. Amazing opportunity to offer someone of my age as well. So it's nice that Ben reckoned that I'd do a good enough job that even with a heavy edit, it'd be good enough to go in the mag. So,
yeah, you talked about blogs. Did you have your own website while you were doing that? 'Cause, I mean, I don't know anything really about technological stuff. Call me an old fogey, but a lot of my friends used to write blogs and take pictures, but it was more of a personal thing. People write things down to get things off their chest and all that sort of thing. So, when you were traveling, did you find that was a good way of like reaching out as well?
Yeah, I think I did hope that people outside, like my immediate friends and family, would read it. Definitely. I think what I used to do was I'd post my photos to Magic Seaweed. Okay. And then if I got lucky, they'd end up on like the front page, and then I'd put a link. I think I put a link in the description of that photo saying like, oh, come and read this on my blog. But yeah, it definitely was a way to try and share bits of, I'm pretty sure no one read it, but it definitely was, the idea was that I wanted to share articles and stories with people already by that point, I think. Yeah,
it's quite an interesting, I've never really thought about it too much, because I've never been a writer. I've never been particularly into photography. I did kind of like, start to take a few photos. When I was talking about before about spending a bit of time down here at Watercape taking photos. I remember going out into the lineup, name dropping at Uluwatu in Indo, and I had this little crappy disposable waterproof camera that had like a little bezel on the top of it. I remember putting that down the top of my little rash vest and taking it out and take some photos. God knows what happened to that, but I remember doing little things like that, which is kind of cool. But the writing side of it is only now really, when I've started doing this podcast and talking to different people and reading lots of different books, whether it's biographies or surf travel or something, is kind of, it really does like put a little bit more of a spark into you. I mean, these days now, and this is one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about the magazine as well, is everything's all about, again, what we started talking about at the very beginning, people putting edits out of videos, and you've got these vlogs now. People's content is more visual and is all over social media, so everyone can make videos. Whereas, do you feel that it's kind of becoming a little bit of a lost art, the written word and photography along with surfing? Because that's initially where, all your information and your travel stories used to come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the photography side probably more closely mirrors the video stuff, where it's the level now is probably higher than it's ever been, and also we have access to, you can just turn your phone on in the morning, go on Instagram and see the greatest surf photography ever created, in your first scroll of the morning. So I think that Instagram has definitely driven the level of photography through the roof, because it gives photographers the opportunity to see what each other are doing, and whether that is they want to swim bigger, heavier waves, or they want to get more original angles, or whether they're inspired by the kind of more refined, artistic eye of another photographer. Whichever it is, those things are driving them to up their game as well. So I think photography is in a great place. I think writing, I mean, there's definitely less incentive now to write, because there are less magazines who you're going to sell that to. But at the same time, I think I do still see lots of very, very talented writers. I don't know, it's a tricky one for me, because I've only been editing the mag for a couple of years, so I'm not sure what the level, both quantity and quality, of written submissions would have been in a pre-social media, pre-Instagram world, where there were still lots more print magazines. So I can't really compare, but I know that there's still incredible surf writers out there, and I do still see really enthusiastic people who are sort of just starting out as well. So they must find that motivation to get really good at it from something other than the fact that they're going to make a career wholly out of that. Because unless you could be selling a piece to pretty much every print magazine that's still in existence a month, you couldn't really make a living off being just a surf writer. You could go and write for brands. Obviously, we were saying earlier that brands need loads of content still. So while magazines and media outlets have maybe diminished a little bit, there are more brands than ever, and brands are competing harder than ever for people's attention because of social media. And what that means is they have to be creating more and more content than ever. And whilst that's mostly videos and photos, they also do these trips where they have a written element too. So brands like Rourke, for example, and Rip Curl, they still send their teams on a team trip, and then have a writer go along and come up with a story from the trip, which then they'll publicize on their website, or they'll try and get it placed in a magazine. So I'm not sure. I don't think that answers your question, but in terms of a comparison, it probably is diminished slightly, but I'm confident that there's still a lot of very passionate and talented surf writers out there, to mean that the art's still alive and well, I hope, for some time to come.
I was trying to figure it out yesterday, like I said, when I got I subscribed to Wavelength before I got in touch with you, and it came through the door yesterday. And thinking about what I was going to talk to you about, and the conversations that I'd like to have with you, I was trying to think, what is kind of like the lost piece with writing? and reading magazines as opposed to the visuals. So it's really easy just to sit there and watch YouTube or watch the WSL contest. Like the Maui Pro just started yesterday with the women's event running. I was like, what's been lost? Well, while you're talking then, I couldn't figure it out. And I was like, it's imagination. The whole purpose of having a written word in front of you is that you have a photograph or a couple of photographs from maybe a piece of an article that's been written on the magazine that's in front of you. But while you're reading those words, you're not looking at that picture. For me, I'm imagining being there while the person's talking in my head. And I think that's a little bit what people are missing with watching videos, because your imagination and you're like, oh, that sounds so cool, I want to go and do something like that. You don't really have that because you've got that visual stimuli from watching something right in front of you. Your brain doesn't have to do anything. You just kind of like sit there and go, yeah, that was pretty cool. But then it doesn't spark your curiosity, I guess, to go and look and do something or read something else.
For sure. I think that's definitely it. Like I often think it's the mark of a really successful article where you're halfway through reading and your brain actually it sparks something in your brain and your brain actually starts wandering off onto something else that's related to that article. And I think you could, when I'm writing, I think obviously a big part of writing is you want to hold your reader's attention. You want them to flow through the narrative as you're laying it out. But at the same time, I think that is the really amazing thing about reading a story rather than looking at an image, that you engage with an idea and you'll connect it to something completely different in your head, that it will make you think of that, or you'll think, oh, actually I never thought of it like that. And then you'll begin sorry you'll think, I've never thought of it like that before, and you'll start thinking about something completely different. And I don't think you get that in the same way. I think you get it with really good filmmaking. I think really good filmmaking in surfing and beyond has the ability to convey a narrative and inspire ideas in a way that really good writing can. But I think with photography, not in the same way. It's more of an abstract medium. I think you can think. I think you can think it. You'd really like to be there, or that's it. It can inspire awe, or it can inspire desire, but it probably doesn't send your mind off spinning. Like you described there.
Yeah. So, being the editor of Wavelength, how did you get into that role? Because obviously, from an outsider's point of view looking in, that is you're the top guy there. What were the hurdles that you went over from leaving university, photography and all that to become, one of the UK's leading surf magazine editors?
Well, so I think I got really lucky with the timing. That's the first thing. So the magazine had just been taken over by new owners 5 years ago in 2015. They had just been taken over by new owners, and Tim Nunn, who was a really great editor of Wavelength and was editor for a really long time, was coming to the end of his editorship. He was ready to move on to new things. He just started the plastic project, which was his thing. So he was moving on to that. And I think to kind of fill in a little bit of the workload in the first summer where the new owners had just taken it over, they said, let's get an intern. And so they put a call out on their social media to say that they'd like an intern to do photography and help run the social media. And so I applied for that. And so I got that. So in my second year of uni, I went and lived down in Newquay for the summer in 2014 or 2015, maybe 2014. And then worked behind a desk with this new team, basically, because these new guys had taken it over. And so everyone was kind of learning on the job. And we also had the ability to sort of carve out a little bit of a new idea for what Wavelength could be. So they brought on a new art director called Colin, who came from a London background. He'd worked in big agencies in London. He's an amazing designer and art director. And he wanted to move down to Cornwall with his family. And so his friend Lewis already worked at the mag. So he said, to Colin to move down and become the art director. And that's what set Wavelength off on kind of the art direction path that it's on now, which is making it a lot more design focused and design led. And then in terms of the editorial direction, I kind of got to be there when the new owners were still hashing out what they wanted the editorial direction to be. So even though I was just an intern, and then after that internship, I went back to uni and worked on a couple stories for Wavelength while I was back at uni in my third year, and then finished in my third year and rejoined the team. Throughout that process, I felt like I got to have a little bit of involvement right from the very beginning in forging that editorial direction. So then when we went for a couple of interim editors while we were just trying to find our feet, and then we moved to like a guest editor model. And so we had a guest editor in, and I always supported the editors in a sort of editorial assistant capacity. That was my role back then. And then after we had that guest editor, I'd ended up doing quite a lot of the work on that mag. So the bosses said to me, would you like to be the guest editor of the next one? And I thought, well, I'm not really ready to do that, to be honest. I'm sure, looking back, I definitely wasn't. But I took it on and was like, yeah, I'll have a go. And so I guest edited that one. And then from there, they were sort of like, well, instead of finding a new guest editor every time, would you like to just carry on editing? And I was like, yeah, definitely, I'll have a crack at it. So I think it was that, yeah, it was a lot of luck in the fact that I happened to be there right at the very start when the new owners took over and they were looking for a new editorial team, and I sort of put my hand up, and then I worked with them for those first 2 or 3 years of their ownership to kind of help the editors forge the new editorial direction. So when it came time to kind of take over, I had a pretty good idea of like what direction we all had a consensus on what direction we wanted it to go in, and the art directors included. So I had a good working relationship with them already. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up in that position.
It's a pretty cool way of doing it, because you're almost like going through rites of passage with also your dedicated, what you would call probably loyalty as well, because you're going through that process and learning all the key skills you need to be where you are now. Probably did you have in the back of your head that you wanted to do that, or is it just kind of one of those things that kind of just happened?
Yeah, I don't know. I always wanted to, ever since I was really young and I started submitting those photos and articles to Four Corners, I always wanted to work for Wavelength. And I always maybe wanted, I don't know exactly whether I'd never really thought about the editor role, because I thought I'm probably not good enough a writer. I didn't even do English A-level or whatever. And back then I thought that was really important. Like, I haven't done any journalism qualifications and I didn't even do English A-level and my spelling's not very good. So I don't know if I was ever shooting for that role specifically. I think I wanted a senior photographer role more. But then, yeah, as it went on, and I sort of, I don't know, I feel like it's a thing that everyone experiences when they enter adulthood or enter the workplace or whatever, that actually you figure out that everyone's kind of just learning on the job. And it's very rare that you come across someone where you're like, oh, wow, that person has just completely got their job 100% nailed and they know exactly what they're doing. So I think the fact that I got there and saw that everyone was kind of winging it and everyone was kind of learning on the job and we were all working to try and build Wavelength up together, that I thought oh, well, maybe I could have a crack at it. I've done maybe 5 issues or something as an editorial assistant. So I had a pretty good idea of how it all works. So I thought, well, there's no harm in having a crack at it. So yeah, I guess it's a combination of the two. It was a big aspiration for me to work for that company, but I don't know if I was necessarily always shooting for the editor role.
What goes into the making of a magazine? So you went to a issue that I got through the door yesterday. What goes into making something like that? So I was going to say, well, obviously you've got your writers that write the stories and then the photographers, and they send everything in. You tell me what goes into making a magazine.
So when I did my first issue, I decided that it would be cool to have all of the content in the issue built around a central theme, which is not something we were doing before, but I think it was because we dropped from doing 6 a year to doing 4 a year. And I thought it'd be cooler if instead of tying it to the time frame, because also the aspiration for everyone in the team was we wanted these to be really timeless things. We wanted it to be like a book that you could pick up again in 5 years and it wasn't going to feel like the content was old, So I thought that maybe a good way of doing that was setting out a theme and then building all of the stories and all of the photography and even some of the design ideas around that central concept. And so I've stuck with that. So the first part of the process of creating any issue is figuring out what the theme's going to be. And generally how that happens is I'll be getting submissions through quite a lot throughout the 6 months in between the two editions, give or take. And so I'll be getting submissions throughout that entire time, and I'll be kind of reading this editions. I'll be getting submissions throughout that entire time. And I'll be reading those submissions, and if there's a couple that I like, I'll look at maybe if there's a common thread that links them, and then that will be our theme. And then I'll put that theme out to our pool of contributors and say, this is the theme, I want kind of responses on this idea. And the themes all come in very different ways. So I'll use the summer edition, so not the one that we've just done, but the one before is quite a good example of how it all came together. Is that right? Oh God, I always forget what's in these magazines after I make them. Is it the summer that went on with that?
Dude, you must have done so many that you kind of all molds into one, really.
Yeah. Hold on, let me think before I go off on one and say the wrong issue. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I'll use the winter edition that we've just done as a good example. And it started way back when we were making the one before, and a guy called Adam sent me a story that he'd written, and he was an ex-copper. He used to work as a policeman up in Scotland. And it was a story that was kind of fiction, but kind of fiction based on his life. That was about when he worked a night shift on the beat in this Scottish city, and maybe Dundee. It is somewhere. Let me start again. Where the fuck is that?
It was Aberdeen, wasn't it?
It's Aberdeen. Yeah.
Yep. It's only because I read it yesterday.
So the idea for the theme for the winter edition, the one we've last done, came initially because I got sent this story by this guy called Adam, who was a policeman up in Aberdeen. And he wrote this story that was based on, it was a kind of a fiction, but it was based on his real lived experiences, where he'd spent a night on the beat in Aberdeen, and it included some of the stuff that he'd done. And then in the morning, he went and had a Dorney to kind of, and it was his way of like washing off all the experiences of this night before. And the first thing I thought when I read it was, if you'd been sharing the lineup with him that morning, you wouldn't have had any idea about the 9 hours previous. You'd think maybe this is a guy who's just jumped in for a surf before work, and so that got me thinking about like there are lots of very well-worn narratives in surfing and lots of iconic characters who we know very well, but maybe there are lots of really interesting sort of untold stories as well, and lots of interesting lived experiences that fall outside of the scope of those narratives that we tell all the time. So I sort of set off looking for stories like that, for characters who maybe fall outside the scope of the people you'd read about in a surf mag all the time, and basically it's anything unseen. So that I always have quite specific ideas for the theme, but then I try and make them more general when I put them out to the contributors so that they can respond on it in any way they want to, really. So in that edition, we ended up with an excerpt from a book called How to Read Water, which is about how the Pacific Islanders learn about the swell patterns on the surface of the water, and they use that to navigate. So they could tell, like, if there was they obviously knew the dominant wind direction, so they could know which way was south, for example, if they knew that the dominant wind always came from the south. But they would know what a north swell looked like in the pattern of the water, and they would know what a west swell looked like in the pattern of the water. And so they would use those swell patterns to deduce then which way's west and which way's north. And they would also know when they were in the swell shadow of an island. And so, yeah, we went from something like an initial idea to something as abstract as that, because it sort of fell under the umbrella of an unseen thing. You know, they had to train themselves to see and understand these patterns, whereas if you stuck a normal layman in their boat, they would have just seen rocky sea all around them. So that's the kind of breadth of like response on the theme that I always try and encourage. So yeah, that's the next stage of the process, is getting people to respond on the theme, and then I'll pick all the stories, and then picture editing, kind of go off and try and find photos to accompany the stories, and that generally takes me like to lots of interesting places. It's always quite tricky, that bit, but it can be super enjoyable as well. So I wrote a profile on a Canarian guy called Sergio Halcon, who's one of the first guys to surf El Camal, the wave in Lanzarote. Had a super interesting life throughout the 70s. He sort of travelled all over, went to Hawaii, ended up in a Moroccan jail for a bit. And to track down photos from his, to accompany his article, I ended up calling lots of people, and I spoke to Jeff Hackman in Hawaii, because Jeff had spent a lot of time on Lanzarote hanging out with Sergio, and then Jeff put me onto his mate who he reckoned might have had a camera at that time, you know, and I ended up speaking to this guy, David Weaver, who worked for Quicksilver in the early 90s and had a slide film camera, and he FedExed his slides over from Hawaii. So I received this box of slides, super exciting, and went and scanned them all in, because we got a slide scanner at the office. And they ended up just being the perfect accompaniment, because there are all these photos of them on these like feral surf trips, you know, all around the Canaries, sleeping in caves and stuff. So yeah, it can be, getting photos can be as complicated as that, or it can just be as simple as hitting up a photographer and saying, hey, I know you've been to this place, you know. So for the Reading Water one, what I did was spoke to this guy who's like an Indonesia-based drone photographer, and sort of told him what the article was about, and was like, have you got photos that illustrate those wave patterns and how they go between the islands? And he was like, yeah, and he sent me all these incredible like aerial shots where you can see the islands and then the way the waves move between them, which illustrates the story really well. So that's that's getting photos, and then we move on to, once I've secured all that, we move on to the design phase. So I'll sit down with our art director, who's a guy called Ali, and our lead designer, who's a guy called Henry, and we'll have a meeting, and I'll run them through all the content, and I'll show them any photos I've got already, and they'll start to think about like creative title treatments and the whole like look and flow of the whole magazine from a like a art and design perspective, and they'll start working on that. And then we do lots of picture editing together. So I will have made them a folder of like my favorite shots that I think should accompany that story, and then they'll decide which ones sit where on the page. So they'll say that one looks good next to that one. No, we can't have that one. So then there's always a bit of debate about like, are we going for like the best high performance banger shots, you know, or are we going to put loads more lifestyle in because we want to create more of a feel of that side of the story? So there's always a lot of discussion on that front. And then we'll pick the cover at some point during that stage as well, which is basically, I'll just hit up as many photographers as I can think of, who I think, because we do two, technically they're the summer and the winter edition. So each time we want to have, because we always pair the cover image with a color as well, which goes on the back cover and then serves as kind of our colorway that we use to promote each edition. So I always want to go for a summery-ish image and a wintry-ish image to go on the covers. But beyond that, there's not really any stipulation. I just want to see as many photos as possible, and then we put them all up on the wall and choose as a team. And because we do it over at this unit in Newquay, which also shares with a framers and a belly board guy who makes belly boards. So we'll get everyone in the unit like up onto the top floor when we're deciding on the cover and kind of get everyone's input. And there's loads of that brings up loads of really interesting opinions. And then we show it to the bosses as well, the publishers, who've always got their own kind of spin on it as well. Like we look at it from a really like artistic point of view, and they're always interested in, you know, is this going to sell, obviously. So yeah, we always have a big debate about the cover. Sometimes it comes down to the wire. We always have a big debate about the cover. Sometimes it comes down to the wire. And occasionally I have told someone they've got the cover and then they haven't, which is that's never gets you in the good books with the photographers. But yeah, it's always It's always a big point of debate. And I think that just about covers it. I'm sure there's loads more bits I missed out. Oh, I send the whole mag to my colleague Paul to do captions, because by that point in the process, when I've just been like staring at all the stories and the photos for months, and then working on all the layouts with the designers, like the idea of them trying to come up with something interesting to say about each photo, my brain's just like pickled. So I send them to him. So if you love the captions, that's all Paul. I can't take any credit for that bit, but that's about covers it. That's about the process.
Do you find when people send you the stories that you're obviously reading them all as well? Do you find that you have to do much change to it, or is it just kind of, forgive my ignorance a little bit, because I know literally nothing about it. So are you like changing punctuation, saying this doesn't read right a little bit, and then do you do that for each story? Or do you have like an under editor as well that kind of helps you out, and you kind of the guy that goes, yeah, that's the one there that we're doing?
Yeah, so so it depends on the contributor. I've got some contributors who are amazing writers and super literary, and actually much more advanced in their writing than I am, certainly. And so those guys, I tend not to really touch it. I'll just let it be, because I think anything that's in there is there's one guy in particular, and I found one mistake in his recent thing, and I was like pretty proud of that, because usually his stuff is just flawless and perfect. And then there's other contributors who I have them in there because they have a really interesting take on things, but they're not necessarily really literary or really, trained in a writerly way. They haven't done, loads of training. And so those guys and girls I will like edit a little bit more. But I always try and preserve their voice. I think that's really important. So I know there are some magazines that do really heavy edits, from what I've heard, where you'll send them a first draft and it will come back with loads cut and loads. And occasionally I have to cut big chunks out, but it's pretty rare. Generally, I'll just try and tweak like grammar and spelling and stuff, and some stuff definitely does slip through, because no, I don't have a sub editor. Unfortunately, I would love to have a sub editor. That would be good, because occasionally it's hard picking up a mag that's been out for a month and spotting a mistake in it, and you're like, where was I sat reading that where I missed that? But the answer is probably maybe it was late and we'd been working for 10 hours or whatever. So, but nah, it's all good. I think people forgive you a few little mistakes, don't they? I think it's okay.
I was just thinking about 16-year-old Luke Gartside writing that little article piece for Bournemouth and sending it in, and how gutting it potentially could be, where you've spent, put your heart and soul into something, and then it comes out and you're like, I didn't write that.
Yeah, and I think definitely for the writers who really pride themselves on being great writers, it is pretty gutting if you take big chunks out of it. But then there's other guys who maybe, so we have some people who do more interview style stuff, and then I think their skill set is really in the way that they interact with whoever they're interviewing. So hopefully I like to think they'd be a little bit less guarded over, if you were to knock out a whole question or something. Hopefully they wouldn't take it quite as personally as if you're siding out a great long literary paragraph from one of our like real writers contributors.
With the we were talking about it earlier, with the sort of like the decline in surf magazines or surf literature at the moment, with Surfer magazine, going under a few months ago. Do you feel like the culture with magazines is kind of changing a little bit, or from a magazine editor and a sales point of view, are those subscriptions and people buying them in the shops, is it still as prevalent as it was?
Yes, it kind of goes through waves. Our subscriber numbers change quite a lot year on year, and this year's actually been a really good year for subscriptions. It partly owes to we've done some really cool collaborations with brands who've put up really cool product for people who want to subscribe. Like those free gifts definitely go a long way to encouraging people to take the plunge. And then we hope that once they get the magazines and they read them, they'll be like, oh yeah, this is great. So it's almost like a bit of sweetness. So I think that's helped in a big way. But so yeah, our subscriber numbers have been pretty steady in the time that I've worked there. It's changed. The biggest change is obviously going from 6 issues down to 2 issues. So the subscription as a result has become, it's a little bit cheaper. And also, I don't know, I think it feels a bit more special now because you're getting those 2 big thick issues a year rather than 6 that you might end up putting in the recycling. So
did those numbers reduce due to the fact that people weren't like buying it every couple of months, or was it a decision made to make it like what you're saying? It's more of a, you're looking forward to maybe getting that book, that seasonal book that comes through, whether it's, you know, the winter edition or the summer edition that comes through. And then that way you can be more articulate and concentrate more on that issue, as opposed to just having lots of stories and just whacking it into something because it needs to go out every 2 months.
Exactly that. Yeah, that was a major part of it. The other big part was we wanted to focus a lot more on digital content. So the idea with reducing from 6, first to 4 and then to 2, was that our content output would actually stay exactly the same. Like, we still generate just as much content, we still write just as many stories and publish just as many photos as we did back then, but a lot of it goes online now. So we wanted to kind of keep the quality of our online output as the same as what we would have put in the magazine when we were doing 6, and then save only like the very best, most interesting, engaging stuff for actual print, because it's really expensive and obviously not great for the planet to churn out as much print as you possibly can, you know? So I think it made a lot of sense with the shifting landscape in terms of also the way brands wanted to work with us. It was just kind of a confluence of a lot of factors, but mainly what you say, the thing that excited me about it most from an editorial perspective was it gives me that time and that space to like make sure that the print is really, really good, because we're never rushing because we're like, oh, we got to churn out one and then we got to churn out another one in a month, you know? So yeah, that was it. That was it from my perspective, really.
Do you feel that, you know, going back to sort of like the magazine digitalization of the world at the moment, do you feel magazines are going to slowly tether out and the digital formats are going to replace it? Or do you think magazines are still going to be quite timeless?
Yeah, I think it will be a case of only a few will survive, probably, because the desire to read stuff in print and also read the sort of stories that end up in print but you wouldn't necessarily read on a screen. You know, like I rarely read a 5,000 word article on a screen because you get distracted halfway through. You get a notification or something comes flashing up and you get distracted, whereas people sit and read huge books with 100,000 words in or whatever. So I think for people who want longer form stuff, there will always be print magazines that cater to that in surfing. I just think that's the way it's heading. And for surf magazines that maybe focus on shorter form content, I think that will probably migrate more online, as we've seen it doing. You know, like it's not exactly me looking into my crystal ball that's the trend over the last couple of years, isn't it? That a lot of the mags have either folded completely or they've migrated their whole content offering to web. I think that trend will continue, but at the same time, they'll definitely always. I can't ever see the Surfer's Journal folding. Really, like the amount of love and sort of the association with quality and how important it's considered within the community. I'd be very surprised if there's a day when that doesn't exist.
Yeah, some of those magazines are you know, like what you're doing with Wavelength. You know, you talk about the Surface Journal. They only pump out a couple of issues a year as well, and that content is really, really important because, you know, I've had. You remember in the old days with Surfer Magazine, you open it up and there was a few articles in there, but the majority of it was ads. How do you, from your perspective, being an editor, why do you think those magazines have folded? Do you think it's because they've not moved with the times quick enough? Or do you just think that, people aren't buying them because they're too heavily involved with advertisements, which, for me, I'd probably read a story and I get fed up with it and I just put it down because I don't want to see Gabriel Medina with his, wetsuit again. It's just kind of, been there, done that.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think people got really bored with those big commercial magazines. They got bored not only of the actual pages that were clearly adverts, but also how much of the editorial content was just completely coloured by the commercial line that the sponsor of those surfers was putting out. The example that everyone always gives that seemed to really wind people up was the idea that with some magazines... the example a lot of people give. Should I move a bit?
Just move it closer. That's it.
Is that good?
Cool. Yeah.
Should I start again? What's the question? Just about the commercial to commercial. Yeah. So
why the magazines have disappeared, and
I think it definitely has a lot to do with it that people got bored of not just the pages that were. Not there being too many ads, but also that some of the stories were too coloured by the fact that they were really just another promotion for the brand. So you'd see the page with the advert and the product and the logo, and then you'd read a story, and the story was also just promoting that exact same brand again. You thought, well, this is just 9 pages of advertising. So I think that it was partially that, and of course those magazine editors who work for magazines like that, like I think Surfer was a bit like for a time, would argue that is how they needed to be to survive. They needed that advertising money to keep going. So I think it's partially that. I also think it's the role of magazines has been shifting near constantly since their inception, really. That originally they were for news, they were how you found out the contest results, and they were how you connected to surfing. And obviously with the internet, that got taken away a little bit, and so then they adapted to being more about trip stories. It was almost like for a long time in a lot of magazines, all you'd really find were very similar stories of accounts of pro surfers going on a surf trip. And so I think people probably got a little bit tired of the same old format, and I think all magazines were guilty of it to an extent. I think that's what the Surfers Journal did really well at back in the day, that they came in, kind of smashed that formula and said, we're not going to just here's a couple of guys with stickers on their board. They went to this place. There was some sort of mishap, maybe their car broke down or they had but it all came good in the end because they scored really good waves. And they said, no, we're going to focus on much more interesting human interest stories than that. And so I think a lot of the magazines that are still around now have followed in their footsteps in that regard, to say, actually, we're going to do because it is in food writing, for example, and in fashion writing, they don't just turn up somewhere, have a meal, say how good it was, and then leave. They use food as a springboard or an entry point to explore much wider things, wider cultural things, wider societal things, or interesting characters who have got these interesting human interest life stories that intersect with food. And I think for a long time, only small parts of the surf media were really doing that. So I think that this is my personal opinion, because those are the kind of stories that I like personally. I'm sure there are still people out there who really love reading a classic surf trip story, where they go and they score amazing waves and you see the photos of those amazing waves and then you move on. Maybe some people don't want it to be more complicated, or suddenly bringing something in about they visited this place and this is the political climate of that place. Maybe some people are I'm not interested in that. But for me, I've seen the magazines that are doing really well now are the ones who've diversified from that very well-worn format, and the ones who clung quite tightly to the kind of stories that surf magazines have always told are the ones who've maybe struggled a bit now. Now readership has shrunk and the internet's taken over a little bit.
I think definitely what you're saying has kind of gripped a little bit with me, because one of the things that made me put down surf magazines a while back was one of the advertisements that I was talking about, but two was there's only so many stories, like you're saying, that you can read about pros going away and scoring waves. The stories that I want to read are the human interest stories, like you're saying. I want to hear about Dave from Scarborough, who is pretty decent at surfing, and he goes to some far-torn island in Fiji or, French Polynesia or somewhere like that. And, he's living off the land and he's working with the communities. He's, a great story I saw during lockdown actually was some of the people that got stuck on the islands around the Mentawais doing surf trips there, and they couldn't go home. So they were stuck there for like 3 or 4 months, and they were like, well, what we're going to do? Well, they were helping the locals build the roads and, fixing up houses and, in the fields, helping with the farming, the crops, but also scoring amazing waves because the lineups were empty because no one was surfing them. And those stories there that are individualizing people that aren't in the media, they're not your Gabriel Medinas, not your John Florence's or, your pro surfers. They're the people that kind of grasp you, because when you're reading it, like we were saying earlier, you're then identifying with them and you're finding some form of connection with those as well. And I think sometimes probably, I haven't read Surfer magazine for a very, very long time, but you kind of losing that contact with people as well.
Yeah. To be honest, I haven't either. So it's possible that I'm doing something that people sometimes do with Wavelength that is kind of annoying, which is having an opinion on the content without actually having read it for about 10 years. So I could be totally wrong. And if you were to look at all the magazines that have folded over the last 10 years, it's possible that it's not the case that most of them spent most of their column inches running stories that were just classic, normal, pro surfer surf trips. I could be totally wrong about that, but it's just more of a feeling that I have, that exactly like you say, the stories that people want to engage with are ones that tackle something a little bit further outside of surfing and look at how surfing intersects with something else. And it's also there's so much more scope for stories like that, because surfing kind of intersects with loads of stuff, doesn't it? Especially within the realm. So for example, a couple stories, I wrote a story last year about do you know about Diego Garcia?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I looked at that because my original interest in it was because I found an old article about a serviceman who'd been stationed there and had managed to either sneak a board in or fashion one out of wood that he found.
No, you do have to.
Yeah. And he'd gone off and found some waves, and I thought, oh, that's a cool story. Here's a guy who's been stationed on a remote tropical island, which has waves, and obviously you're not supposed to surf because it's a military base, and he's serving. But he's found a way to go and surf. But then obviously reading about that place opened up a much wider story about the history of the island and everything that's gone on there. And so surfing just was kind of the way in to tell a much wider story. And so it's stories like that I really love, I think. Those ones where it's ostensibly about surfing a little bit, but not really. There's loads of other interesting stuff to talk about as well. Yeah,
definitely. There's one thing I did want to talk to you a little bit about. It's quite a controversial subject, I guess, is lots of magazines and literature out there are very, how can I say it, white Caucasian orientated. And there are lots of different cultures all over the world that do surf. And there are kind of some biases, I find. Whether it's regardless of your religion, your colour or something like that, you do find that the majority of magazines and literature, like I was saying, are more orientated that way. But also with gender as well. A lot of magazines are more focused towards males, for instance, for surfing magazines, because the sport is predominantly male dominated. I don't know the stats behind it, but I'll probably say it is. But there are some amazing women surfers as well. Women have their own separate magazine to say the normal everyday run-of-the-mill magazines. Do you find, being an editor, that's something that you do take into consideration sometimes, or is it just because those stories are not, I'm not saying Wavelengths as a specific magazine, I'm using this as a generalization, that magazines would probably not put articles or have articles in their format because they just don't have people writing it and sending it to you?
Yeah, so it is something that we've made a real conscious effort to address over the last couple of years, that both representation of communities that aren't based in either Australia, Hawaii or Europe or America, because like you say, there's a massive and incredibly diverse population of global surfers, like in Indonesia, across Africa, in Hawaii, that actually it's strange. Lauren Hill writes about it really eloquently and beautifully in her new book She Surfed, where she says actually the idea of surfing being this kind of white male middle class thing is really new, because prior to that it was a sport invented by the Polynesians, there are lots of different origin stories, and surf historians argue about where it started first, but the main candidates are kind of West Africa, South America, or the Polynesian islands. So that no part of it really in its origins was a white European sport. And of course the white Europeans tried to stamp it out in Polynesia. So it's only through its middle history that it's taken on this role I think it's largely, I know it's not quite a question you're asking, but to address it briefly, I think it's because largely in the places where in the biggest the surfing nations that are most dominant in the surf media, so Australia, America and Europe, a lot of the coastal populations are really not very diverse at all. There are some glaring exceptions like Los Angeles in America, for example, but just using Britain as an example, there is very, very low ethnic diversity in Cornwall. And people ask sometimes, like, why aren't there more black surfers in Cornwall? And it's a really tricky one to answer, because obviously the simple answer is just because there's such low ethnic diversity in this place as a county. But actually that doesn't really answer it, because most of the surfers I'm friends with around Newquay, and myself included, are people who've moved down here to surf. We didn't grow up here, we're not from Cornwall. But leaving that aside, yes, I've definitely worked hard over the last couple of years to make sure that there is more diversity, both in gender and ethnicity, in the stories that we're telling in the magazine. Not as some kind of like tip my hat to political correctness or whatever, but just because actually that makes for way more interesting stories if you represent a more diverse range of people. So then you're not just telling the story of effectively the same person over and over again, because the guy who, the local surfer or the local the local female surf club in Sri Lanka, the women who are in that are going to have a vastly different experience of surfing than someone from North Devon, the middle class bloke who lives in Croydon. So it's not about like, oh, we've got to be more diverse. It's like, if we want to tell an array of interesting stories, then covering an array of different ethnicities and genders is the way to do it. So yes, it is something we've tried to do. We're not there yet at all in terms of it's not diverse enough. It's still mostly the people who you've always seen in surf mags, and I think there will always be a little bit of a lag in terms of what you said, where the vast majority of people I have submitting stories to me, both the author and the people they're writing about, are usually from a middle class European background. But it is changing slowly, and I think the most exciting avenue of development is happening right now across the continent of Africa, which is obviously a silly thing to talk about as a big whole, but it is something that's happening across large parts of the continent, and it's happening through various organisations. I did an interview with Mikey February recently, a really cool interview with Mikey, and he was talking about how we were both saying actually how inspired we were by the reaction to the Dylan Graves Nigerian Weird Waves episode.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen it. So basically, Dylan and the Vans team go and visit this community in Nigeria, which is built up around a man. I mean, they accidentally built a wave in the mouth of the harbour. It breaks off a harbour. It kind of breaks off a jetty, like a wedge off a jetty. And this amazing grassroots surf community is like sprung up around it. And all these kids, and it was just a really good story. It was a real interesting, cool piece. And Mikey's like, that's exactly the kind of exactly the kind of storytelling around African surfing that we want to do. We want to go and visit these interesting little communities, which no one really bothers to cover, and tell the stories of the people who live there. And I think the more of that happens, the more interesting surf storytelling is going to become. Because like I say, the thing that makes surf storytelling interesting is the diversity of characters and backgrounds and life stories. And the way that you're going to find that is by going to different places, which traditionally the surf media has maybe ignored a little bit. And also that didn't exist before. That's the other thing. Like, it's not entirely true to say that these are communities of people in nations outside of those mentioned that have always been thriving and just ignored by the surf media. A lot of them are newer, novel surf communities where actually surfing has only taken hold in that place in the last 5 years or so. So I think there's a little bit of a lag in the surf media sort of catching up to telling those stories, Wavelength included. But I hope over the next couple of years, it's something that will get easier and easier as the popularity of surfing grows, and that kind of births a whole new generation in those places of local photographers and local writers who can email me and say like, hey, I live in this place and there's this amazing surf community and this interesting person with this interesting story, put it in your magazine. And I'll be like, yes, definitely send that to me. That's great. So
I think the reason why I'm asking that question is because I was watching Sam Bleakley's Extraordinary Corners, and it just kind of opened a thought process in my head, because I think I read a book a while back which was about Israeli surfers surfing during like the fighting period there. And especially if you look at the coastline, and you look at the areas around there, you wouldn't expect waves to come through there. Like the Mediterranean, for instance, it's not a vast ocean. How would the swell be created? I'm not going to go into that. There's a lot of science involved with it. My point being is that those communities there have been there for a long time, but you wouldn't necessarily see them unless someone wrote a book or put an article into a magazine that you would read. So let's say you're white middle class guy, girl, reading them, doesn't read a magazine, doesn't read a book. You're not going to know about those sort of things. But why would you? If you're not interested in surf media, you might just be surfing because you enjoy doing it, and you're not interested in magazines, you're not interested in books, you're not interested in the surf media as a whole platform. But what I find quite interesting is that, like you're saying, it's slowly coming to the forefront now, where you've got lots of diverse cultures that are coming out, and people who are, high profile people like Sam Bleakley, for instance, who does the WSL commentary for the longboarding. He's putting some form of content out there to expose and show that people are riding waves, surfing, shaping boards in lots of extraordinary corners that you wouldn't necessarily think of, which I think is a really, really cool concept. And when you start looking into it, you kind of think, yeah, that's pretty cool. You've never thought of that before.
Yeah. So I think there's like 3 evolutionary stages of surf storytelling that we're kind of seeing playing out now. And the first stage is very much like the endless summer version of the narrative, where two white Californian guys go on this quest around the world to these exotic surf destinations, and the waves are very much the focus. And And everything about the journey is sort of geared towards finding these perfect empty waves, and everything else is kind of a bit of a sideshow, is a bit of filler. So they observe the cultures that they come across sort of curiously, but they don't really engage with them in any kind of meaningful way. And then the second chapter is people, surf journalists and storytellers and filmmakers started traveling and engaging much more with the local cultures that they found. And the waves almost, in some of those examples, became a bit secondary. And actually it was about meeting the local people and checking out the local customs. And, when they go to Fiji, they always drink the tea, don't they? And they, watching the traditional dance. But it is still the authors and the surfers are still coming in from a different country and sort of observing and telling their story a little bit and then going home. And I think we're kind of entering a third chapter now, which is about emboldening those people to kind of tell their own story. And I think that's the really exciting bit. And what Sam is doing with Brilliant Corners, and also what Vans is doing with Weird Waves, and what Keperosero's done as well through his work. I see them all as kind of strands of that idea of going in and not treating the culture as just a bit of a curiosity to be sort of acknowledged before heading to the waves, but actually meeting the people and giving them the chance to explain, their perspective and their way of life a little bit more. And I think we're going to keep going more and more in that direction, to the point where it will be like, there won't need to be any intervention from a kind of visiting Westerner at all. It will just be those people taking control of the communities taking control of their own narratives and putting out the stories without the help of any, And I think Instagram does help with that. Like now, if you're a surfer in one of those places where traditionally you might have been ignored by, or if you're a surfer in one of these places where traditionally you might have been ignored by visiting surfers telling their own story, you can start up an Instagram account and you can post photos and you can tell your story directly, and you don't need someone from the surf media to come and effectively put a microphone in your face and say like, come on, tell me this and that. You can just tell it exactly how you want it. And I think Instagram is really positive for that.
Yeah, it's an amazing platform where you can be average person, average guy, average girl, and have an idea to put something out there and grow something massively. You only have to look at influencers. My kids, they were the first people really to kind of show me that you could make money from doing vlogs from the average household. So they are obsessed, or were obsessed, with watching families and their kids playing. And then, they're opening boxes of toys and, they're like, oh, this is this new toy. We've been sent this. Thanks very much. And, before you know it, they started off with 100 followers. They've now got 15 million followers, and people sending them stuff because people are watching them do things, watching other people's lives, which is a really, really weird concept, which theoretically is kind of what Instagram is, isn't it? Is you are looking at people's lives through picture and short videos and a little bit of dialogue, like you were saying earlier. But you can make a living out of do that if you're consistent and passionate about doing that. Which, talking about small communities from Africa or something, probably have never really thought about doing that before. But now they're getting the focal points where people are coming in to do interviews with them, and then maybe they're finding work through doing that, which is a really cool thing. Yeah,
definitely. And I think, absolutely. You nailed it. I think that's how it's gonna keep developing for sure. That soon, I think we're probably heading towards a time when everyone in the world has a phone and has a phone that's connected to the internet. And I think it'll almost certainly have its drawbacks in some ways. But I think one of the positive things about it is it will give everyone a voice and everyone a platform, to mean that if they are if they do have an interesting story to tell, then they have the means to tell that story. Whereas previously they wouldn't have had the means unless someone else decided that their story was interesting enough, you know? I don't know if the positives outweigh the negative, but I'd like to take that as like the positive spin on it, that when everyone's interconnected and everyone's on the internet, then at least, people will be able to tell their stories whenever they want.
I'd like to think that there's a positive in everything. You know, when we were kids, you're like, don't watch the telly, too much telly, because your eyes will go square. I mean, like I say, I've got kids, so I do see the positives and the negatives with it as well. You know, they get stuck watching stuff. And then, I mean, you must have done it yourself. Right, I've got 20 minutes, an hour. I'm going to have a quick look at my phone. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to do this and do that. But then you get stuck scrolling. And then before you know it, 40 minutes of your life, 50 minutes of your life has gone. I think that's where we're going to get lost a little bit. You're going to lose time because you're being pulled into these social media attractions. Have you seen the film Social Dilemma on Netflix?
I think I watched half of it, yeah.
Oh man, that just changed my life. I was like that. I wanted to throw my phone out the window. I was like, this is the devil. It's the devil's tool.
It's about the one how the software engineers at the social platforms like make it so that it's addictive and so it holds as much of your attention as possible.
Yeah, so right? they might put a post, which is what I always found kind of interesting, is that when I loaded up Instagram, there was someone had put something up there like 2 hours ago was the first one, and then 15 minutes ago, then 2 minutes ago. It's like, well, why is this in no order? You know? But then once I watched that, I realized that whatever you're talking about or looking at on other platforms with on your phone are then bringing these feeds to the top, which are then gaining your traction to hold you for advertisements and stuff, which is, I don't know, is it a very clever ploy for advertisers, or is it something that is going to detract you from life as well, because you can get sucked into it super easy?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Pre-reels, so do you know, I don't know, so I have to, but part of my job is spending my life on Instagram, whether that's like through my photography, although I'm not super active of how much of my photography I post, because I spend a lot of time curating the Wavelength Instagram, and a huge amount of that time is sourcing content. So actually, when I get stuck in one of those 40-minute loops, I can sort of half pretend to myself that I was working that whole time. But like, actually, I was just So I think with Reels, which is like the newer feature on Instagram that they've done to copy TikTok, that where they literally just feed you stuff that they know is super engaging content, but very little of it you're not learning anything from any of it, and you're not, because prior to Reels, I would have said that my feed, I'd sort of curated it with stuff I was interested in and surf photographers who I was going to be inspired by, and so I could kind of chalk that time spent scrolling down to like gaining a bit of inspiration. You know, it's not quite the same as going and spending time in a library, you know, and reading lots of great authors and saying like, oh, that has enhanced my literary mind. But it is a sense of, if you want to be a better surf photographer, the best place to start is staring endlessly at loads of amazing surf photography. And so it was good for that. So I sometimes felt like, if people are saying, oh, I'm just wasting my time on Instagram, and oh, it's just taking too much of my attention and I'm not really getting anything from it, sometimes I was inclined to think, well, maybe you just need to curate your feed a little bit better, and because there is amazing stuff on Instagram that's not a waste of your time to look at. It's like enriching to look at. But with Reels, I think that's gone out the window. I don't think I could say that to anyone anymore, because they curate Reels for you, and it's like, obviously the algorithm is based on how much attention you give to it, but like very little of the Reels I get fed leave me feeling inspired to go and try a new surf photography technique. They're all just a funny dance or like some cats doing something. So yeah, is the answer. I definitely think the way it's going, the potential is there to get. But I don't know. It's a good exercise in willpower, isn't it? If you know that that's not a healthy thing for you to do, and it's going to end up, and if you're not just using it to relax or whatever, and it's eating into time when you had wanted to be productive, then you can be like, all right, I got a bit of a challenge here to say like, stop staring at reels when I'm supposed to be working or whatever, and hopefully I think people will adapt and rise to that challenge as we get more used to it. It's just because it's so new, isn't it? They've tapped into something deliberately, according to that documentary. They've tapped into something in our psychology which we're not used to battling with. That pleasure. They're giving you all that pleasure, and so you're not used to going like, no, I need to stop doing this pleasurable. Maybe is something we've been battling with for a long time. Like, no, I need to stop doing this pleasurable thing because it's detracting me from what I should actually be doing. But maybe not in such an acute way before,
If you want to go down the rabbit hole, you think the evolution of the human mind and the body has not kept up with the evolution of technology.
For sure, yeah.
The evolution of technology has just absolutely gone through the roof. So is your brain capable of adapting that quickly to be able to cope with all this social media and this new technology that's obviously advancing monthly?
Yeah, I don't think our brain chemistry could possibly adapt that quickly. I think what can adapt that quickly is like society and culture. And so I already see, you see, ironically, on Instagram, you see a lot of this stuff about putting your phone down and stop getting lost in scrolling. And so I think the more the culture tends in that direction, that it becomes a kind of pervasive cultural idea that it's not a great idea to spend loads of time obsessing over this stuff, just in the same way as we say culturally it's really important to exercise and eat the right food. I wonder if there will become this new cultural norm that it's an unhealthy habit, just like smoking or eating too much sugar, that you've got to make a choice to curb. And I think then we could adapt to that idea that if you start treating it like that in your mind, like, oh, I'm overindulging in something here that I'm spending too much time on, then people will be able to curb it, possibly, I hope.
Yeah. Hey, only time will tell, right?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
So what I'd like to finish on is a little bit of a quick fire round.
Okay.
So being quick fire round, these normally last about 20 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if the rambling I've been doing up until this point is anything to go by, I don't know how quick I'll do my best.
That's super cool. So here we go. So the first one, if you could ride one fin setup for the rest of your life, would it be a single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad, bonzer, or finless?
Am I living here for the rest of my life?
You live where you want to.
It depends where I live. If I'm living here, I'm riding a single fin at the moment. I think I'm just about to get like a twin pin or something with a twin setup. So I'm gonna go for the twin setup. It's the most versatile, isn't it?
Good choice.
Thank
I
you.
like my twinnies.
Yeah.
Favorite surfer and why?
Man, that's a really hard one. I think it's Torren Martin. I think I've got to go with Torren Martin. Just because his style obviously is incredible, and just the way that he like smashes up that hole. Everyone had before him, I feel like everyone had the idea of anyone who rode mid-lengths or twins kind of pigeonholed as this just kind of high line, like arms in the air, do nothing hipster, and everyone wanted to be like, oh, anyone who rides a mid-length, it's like they're just showing off and they're just being a hipster. But the way he blends like performance and power surfing with more classical stylish surfing just smashes that whole pigeonhole. And so many other people have seized on that now as well, like Asher Pacey and Bryce Young. Obviously they were doing it at the same time as Torren. I'm not saying that they were necessarily like inspired by his approach, but and Mikey February, there are so many surfers now who are incredibly stylish and have like classically inspired lines, but blend it with new school power, but a new school kind of powerful progressive approach. So all those guys, they're all my favourite surfer, but especially him.
Last surf film you watched?
Oh man, what's the
Not
last?
A clip. Clips are easy.
last full surf film I watched? I honestly can't remember. It might be one of the ones we were showing at the drive-in. We showed Dogtown and Z-Boys at the drive-in, but I don't think that's technically counts as a surfer. I'll probably thank you. Lost Track New Zealand with Torren Martin.
I was just about to say, you're just talking about Torren Martin and you haven't talked about Lost Track.
I know, yeah. So I think it was that one. I might have watched half of another one since then. I tend to I'll dip in for 20 minutes and then, but yeah, that's the one I like. Went round my mate's house just after lockdown and sat and watched it start to finish. Yeah. Yeah,
there's a good one prior to that as well.
Thank You, Mother.
I can't remember. It's another Need Essential one as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they churn them out. Yeah, no, not...
I think he was surfing like up in Norway somewhere.
Yeah, Nordland maybe. I think it was called Nordland. Yeah,
that was
cool.
Really
good. Yeah.
So I think they just loaded up a Land Rover and just went off track like they did with the motorbikes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was super cool. The first surfing film you ever watched?
Again, I think it was maybe Step Into Liquid. Possibly. I don't know. I remember around that time, as soon as I watched one, I just started watching loads. So, I think, if Dogtown and Z-Boys counts, I think it was Dogtown and Z-Boys. I'm not sure that technically counts, but yeah, maybe Step Into Liquid. Yeah, I'm going to go with that. And
finally, your dream surf trip.
Oh, man. I've been fantasizing a lot about going to Chicama recently. I went to New Zealand and surfed Raglan loads last year. Well, I went once, but I surfed at Raglan for a couple of weeks, and that was just mental. And it's just like, bar the one that we've talked about earlier in this conversation, we don't really have any proper left-hand points around here, or the only couple that we have are like not very cruisy. So I want to go surf like a super perfect, really cruisy left-hand point. So I think I'm gonna go Chicama.
Nice. That's why Indo's the best place for goofies to go there, right?
Yeah, I could, obviously there's all those ones like around. Do you know what? I always really, really wanted to go to Macaroni's, but then my mate told me that the earthquake there has changed it and it's not really mellow at all now. Apparently it's like pretty hectic now. When it gets solid, it's like not like Greenbush standard, but still a lot heavier. So that I scrubbed that off the list. Not cruisy enough. Yeah, it's gotta be Chicama.
Nice. Luke Gartside, thank you for talking to me on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
What a conversation. And I was super interested in the construction of a surfing magazine. Luke is such a cool guy and super knowledgeable in his field. If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow and subscribe on your podcast provider and follow us on Instagram. Thanks for listening.